Most men in the Wild West went to bed hungry. Survival was rarely decided by the revolver, but rather by whatever landed in the saloon kettle that night. Hollywood shows us juicy steaks and crystal-clean glasses. The reality was much harsher. When an outlaw climbed off his horse after days in the desert, or a sheriff pushed open the heavy swinging doors, there was no menu waiting in the kitchen. There were meals meant to fill the belly and keep a man alive for one more day. Today, they are almost completely forgotten. Here are 15 forgotten saloon dishes that outlaws and sheriffs once shared, just to survive until tomorrow. Number 15. Son of a gun stew. This dish was not for the faint of heart. When cattle were slaughtered behind the saloons, the prime cuts went to the wealthy landowners. What was left for the rough men inside the pub? The offal. Tongue, liver, heart, and lining were simmered for hours in heavy cast-iron pots. A handful of coarse salt, onions, and a few dried chili peppers were thrown into the pot. The fat rendered down slowly until a heavy, thick broth formed. Sheriffs and outlaws often sat just a few tables apart, heads bowed over their wooden bowls. In those minutes, the law no longer mattered. Everyone in the room just wanted something warm in their belly and a brief respite from the harsh world outside. Number 14. Hardtack mash. Hardtack was one of the toughest breads of its time, notorious for being rock hard and lasting for years. In the saloon, however, it was turned into a warm meal. In many saloons, the hardtack was crushed with the back of an axe, thrown into boiling water or weak coffee, and stirred until it became a thick, steaming mush. A spoonful of cheap molasses or a splash of bacon grease on top. That was it. It was a meal devoid of pride. It looked like mud, but it provided the necessary energy to survive the next 20 miles in the saddle. Number 13. Pickled eggs and beer bread. Anyone who entered the saloon saw it immediately. The giant murky jar of pickled eggs on the counter. Preserved in vinegar and salt, these eggs kept for months without refrigeration. Proprietors often gave them out for free with cheap beer, but not out of pure generosity. The salt triggered thirst, and the dense homemade beer bread next to it soaked up the alcohol. A man on the run could eat his fill for 5 cents, keeping his back to the wall and his eyes fixed on the door. Number 12. Hangtown fry. This dish originated in California when a condemned man, shortly before his execution, demanded the most nourishing meal the kitchen could whip up: oysters and eggs, fried in hot bacon grease. The story spread through mining towns for years as one of the West's most famous last meals. Before we get to the ingredient in number 11 that saved many a sheriff from starving, just a brief moment. If these almost forgotten stories and the true, unaltered history of our ancestors matter to you, please subscribe to our channel. Help us keep these memories alive so they aren't lost to time. And now, on to number 11, fire pan beans. Since bartenders didn't have the luxury of fresh produce, dried pinto beans were the backbone of the kitchen. They lasted forever and cost next to nothing. To feed many guests quickly, cooks poured pounds of dried beans into cast-iron skillets, placed directly over the hottest part of the embers. They added leftover grease, wild garlic gathered from the plains, and whatever meat scraps were on hand. The beans scorched slightly at the bottom, giving the entire dish a deep, bitter, smoky flavor. It was a hearty, reliable meal that kept you full for a long time and settled the stomach during long, cold nights on watch. Number 10. Salt pork hash. Salt pork was nothing like the bacon we know today. It consisted almost entirely of fat, heavily preserved to survive long journeys in hot saddlebags. In the saloon, cooks used it to stretch what few vegetable rations remained. The salt pork was boiled first to extract the brine, then diced and fried with withered potatoes and onions until the edges were brown and crispy. Outlaws valued this dish because the high fat content provided long-lasting energy for riding. It didn't taste like luxury. It tasted of salt and wood smoke, but it kept your hands steady on the reins. Number 9. Jeremiah's Johnny Cakes flour was expensive and spoiled quickly in the damp air of frontier saloons, so it was replaced by cornmeal. Johnny Cakes were the simplest form of sustenance: coarse cornmeal mixed with hot water and salt. Shaped by hand into thick patties, cooks fried them in the leftover grease from breakfast. They turned dark and crispy on the outside, but stayed dense and hot on the inside. The men broke them apart and used them to scoop up gravy or stew, eating with their hands at the edge of the bar. It was simple fare, but at least it provided bread when everything else ran out. Number 8. Jerky broth. When outlaws hid in the mountains for weeks, they lived mainly on dried wild game or beef jerky. It was as tough as leather and had to be chewed laboriously just to be swallowed. When they finally ventured into a quiet saloon, they didn't order a plate. They demanded a pot. The proprietors took the hard, dusty strips of jerky, chopped them up, and boiled them for hours until the meat softened and released its salt into the water. A handful of crushed roasted corn was added to thicken the broth. The result was a thin, salty broth that went down easily, soothing throats raspy from weeks of trail dust. Number 7. Vinegar cobbler desserts were rare in saloons, as fruit was hard to come by and sugar was a luxury. Yet the cooks were inventive. They discovered that by combining water, a little flour, butter, and apple cider vinegar, they could create a tart, custard-like filling that mimicked the taste of green apples. This mixture was topped with leftover biscuit dough and baked in the embers. It wasn't sweet like modern pies, but the sharp acidity of the vinegar cut through the heavy, greasy food served beforehand. For men who hadn't seen an orchard in years, a single bowl of vinegar cobbler was a rare comfort. Number 6. Parched corn mush. As native tribes well knew, parched corn was the ultimate survival food. Corn kernels were roasted in a dry skillet until they expanded and turned light brown, taking on a nutty flavor. In the saloon, the keeper ground the parched corn between 2 flat stones and boiled it into a thin mush. Milk and sugar weren't necessary. The roasting process gave the corn its own subtle sweetness. It was the kind of breakfast a sheriff ate at dawn, before riding out into a winter blizzard. Light enough to carry, but heavy enough to keep the cold out of his chest. Number 5. Salt salmon and rice. In northern territories and coastal taverns, fresh meat was often replaced by barrels of salt salmon. The fish was packed so tightly in brine that it could survive long wagon journeys inland. Cooks soaked the salmon overnight to make it palatable, then boiled it alongside plain white rice. The rice absorbed the remaining salt from the fish, transforming 2 cheap ingredients into a rich, filling meal. It was a simple, honest food that nourished miners, outlaws, and marshals alike, requiring nothing more than a hot fire and a clean kettle. Number 4. Prairie skillet, wild onion scramble. When supply wagons were delayed by weather or raids, saloons ran out of meat entirely. During these lean weeks, the kitchen relied on whatever could be foraged from the surrounding prairie, especially wild onions. Cooks sliced the onions thin and fried them in old lard until they were dark, sweet, and caramelized. If they had just a single egg, they would whisk it and stretch it across a whole pound of onions. It looked like a meager breakfast, but the intense, sweet flavor brought new life to men who had consumed nothing but dry beans and stale water for weeks. Number 3. The calf's head cheese. On the frontier, nothing was wasted, least of all the head of an animal. When a calf was slaughtered, the head was cleaned and boiled whole in a massive pot, until every scrap of meat fell away from the bone. The meat was seasoned with wild sage and pepper, packed into earthenware crocks, and cooled until it set in its own natural gelatin. Sliced cold and served with coarse salt, it kept for weeks in the saloon cellar. While no delicacy, it traveled incredibly well. It was a dense source of protein a sheriff could pack into his saddlebag before a 3-day manhunt. Number 2. Soda biscuit gravy. When the meat ran out and the pantries were bare, saloon kitchens survived on flour and grease. Soda biscuits were made from flour, sour milk, and baking soda, baked until they were heavy and dense. To turn it into a meal, the cook took the leftover grease from the bottom of the pan, stirred in flour until it browned, and added water until a rich gravy formed. Poured over the heavy biscuits, it was salty, warm, and heavy. It sat like a stone in the stomach, exactly what a man needed when he didn't know where his next meal was coming from. When we think of these places today, we see the romance, but the food was pure necessity. Most of these meals were never properly documented. They existed only in the memories and daily routines of those who prepared them. Number 1. Free lunch. Pickled pork. In the number 1 spot is not a luxury dish, but the foundation of saloon culture. Heavily salted, cheap pork, boiled for hours with white beans. Saloons often offered this food completely free of charge, as long as you ordered a drink. It was the cleverest economic trick of the Old West. Yet, for the homeless drifter, the aging sheriff without a pension, or the outlaw whose luck had run out, this free pot was often the only thing keeping them from freezing to death. It proved that even in the harshest places, there was always a pot on the fire keeping humanity afloat. Some of these dishes didn't disappear because of how they tasted. They vanished because the people who knew how to make them passed away. And that is exactly why you should watch this video right now. It covers the simple morning dishes that carried generations through hard times. 15 forgotten poor man's breakfasts. Seniors living alone actually ate.